The bolt was stripped. Of course it was stripped. In a universe of infinite complexity and boundless cosmic wonder, the one constant Chief Engineer Declan Rourke had identified across 11 years of deep space operations was this: the bolt you needed most was always the one some previous idiot had already ruined. He was elbow deep in the coolant recalibrator cheek pressed against a conduit that smelled like burnt rubber and regret. The temperature gauge on his wrist display ticked upward. 73% efficiency on the warp drive. Not critical. Not yet. But efficiency below 80% meant the jump to the nearest human outpost would take 11 days instead of 9, and Declan had opinions about wasting time. The wrench slipped. Again. He adjusted his grip, braced his shoulder against the housing, and applied torque with the careful precision of a man who'd learned the hard way that forcing things in microgravity environments led to consequences. The bolt caught. Held. Caught again. Third time. The Prometheus lurched, not the polite structural groan of thermal expansion, not the gentle roll of course corrections. This was something violent, something immediate, the kind of lurch that sent a wrench spinning across 40 meters of engine room to embed itself in the far bulkhead with a sound like a gunshot. Declan didn't move. Not yet. He finished tightening the bolt, felt it seat properly, extracted himself from the conduit housing with the unhurried calm of a man who'd survived 2 reactor near misses. One catastrophic hull breach in that incident with the methane pocket that turned an asteroid into a temporary moon. Panic was for amateurs. Engineers assessed. Then the alarms started screaming. 3 different tones, overlapping, hull stress, proximity alert, and the one that sounded like a dying cat, which was the radiation sensor. He'd been meaning to fix that last one for 6 months. It had a tendency to go off whenever someone microwaved fish in the crew mess. This time, he suspected it wasn't the fish. The engine room was a cathedral of controlled chaos. 40 meters of reactor housing conduit runs, magnetic containment arrays, and fabrication equipment crammed into a space that always smelled faintly of ozone and lubricant, and the particular despair of machinery pushed past its rated tolerances. Heat radiated from the warp core housing in visible waves. The deck plates vibrated at a frequency Declan felt in his back teeth. He loved it. It was the only place on the ship where the universe made sense, because here at least the rules were his rules. He pulled up the external sensor feed on his wrist display. His stomach did something complicated. 2 fleets. Massive. The tactical overlay was a nightmare of overlapping transponder signals. Port-side Drathvek destroyers. Their silhouettes like armored fists, brutal and angular and aggressively ugly, in the way that only ships designed by creatures who thought subtlety was a character flaw could be. He counted fast. 2,834 contacts. Starboard side, the Wevari swarm cluster. Hundreds of small contacts moving in eerie synchronized patterns like a murmuration of starlings, if the starlings were made of titanium and wanted you dead. 2,413 ships. Between them, 1 Eckhart-class mining vessel, the MSV Prometheus. 40,000 tons of industrial engineering equipment, 0 weapons, and 1 chief engineer whose day had just gotten significantly worse. Declan's earpiece crackled. "Engine room, respond." Captain Helena Voss. Her voice had that particular quality, the one she used when something had gone catastrophically wrong, but she needed everyone to believe it was merely inconvenient. Declan had worked with her for 3 years. He knew the difference. He tapped his earpiece. "I'm here. Tell me this is a sensor malfunction." "It is not a sensor malfunction." A pause, the kind of pause that contained multitudes. "We are currently positioned at the intersection of 2 active fleet engagements. The Drathvek hegemony and the Oivari compact have been contesting the Fawcett expanse for approximately 6 standard weeks. We were not informed because the war zone was not supposed to extend this far into the survey corridor." Supposed to, great word, very reassuring. Declan pulled up the broader tactical map. The Prometheus sat almost exactly equidistant between the 2 fleets, like a marble someone had dropped between 2 closing fists. The nearest human outpost was 11 days at maximum warp. Maximum warp, which was currently running at 73% efficiency because he'd been fixing the coolant system when the universe decided today was a good day for everything to go wrong at once. "A Drathvek destroyer-class vessel has targeting sensors locked on us." Voss continued. I am currently broadcasting on all neutral party frequencies, invoking the Kethvin Convention on non-combatant vessels. Another pause. The nearest human outpost is 11 days at maximum warp, and our maximum warp is currently compromised because you were recalibrating the coolant system. I was fixing a strip bolt. Her voice dropped half a register. Declan? Just his name. That was how he knew it was bad. I need you to tell me the engine room is functional. The engine room is functional, which was mostly true. The warp drive was at 73% and climbing. The reactor was stable. The mining laser array had a cracked housing from some micrometeorite impact 2 weeks ago, but cracked wasn't destroyed. The waste ejection system was running hot, but that was normal. Everything was fine if you defined fine as capable of keeping the ship operational for another 11 days of crawling through space while 2 alien armadas decided whether to ignore them or vaporize them. What I need you to tell me, Declan said, is that you have a plan that doesn't involve us dying. I'm working on it. The comms went silent. Declan stood in the middle of his engine room, surrounded by the humming machinery that had been his entire world for the last 247 days, and did what engineers do when confronted with impossible situations. He started calculating. The door to the engine room hissed open. 6 arms came through first. That was always how you knew it was Kirsch. The Volnathi liaison mechanic had been assigned to the Prometheus by the Interstellar Engineering Cooperative, ostensibly to facilitate cross-species technical exchange. In reality, Declan suspected it was because no other Volnathi engineer had wanted the posting, and Kirsch had lost some kind of bet. All 4 of Kirsch's eyes were coordinated, ranged in their diamond pattern, the upper 2 tracking the ceiling as if expecting it to collapse. The lower 2 fixed on Declan with an expression that translated across species lines as, please tell me you have a plan. The Drathvek Krish said in the precise formal cadence of someone who'd learned standard from a textbook and never quite shaken the habit, have broadcast a general combat zone order. All vessels within the designated engagement perimeter are classified as valid targets. This includes non-combatant vessels. A pause. This includes us. Kirsch's modulated blue-gray skin shifted in what might have been anxiety. The grinding teeth in the lower jaw worked slightly. What is the human protocol for imminent annihilation? Declan looked at him. We improvise. All 4 of Kirsch's eyes blinked in sequence, top to bottom. That is not a protocol. It's the only one we've got. The Prometheus shuddered again, harder this time. A rolling impact that started at the bow and traveled the length of the ship like a wave, not a shock wave from a distant explosion. Something closer, something aimed. The impact alarm joined the chorus, then the hull breach alarm. Then, because the universe had a sense of humor, the fish microwave alarm. Declan's wrist display lit up with damage reports. Mining laser array housing port side upper deck direct hit. Structural integrity at 78%. The port cargo bay was venting atmosphere through a crack in the outer hull plating. A thin silver stream of escaping air that would on the external cameras look almost beautiful if you didn't think about what it meant. From somewhere above him, through 2 decks of steel and insulation, he heard a sound that wasn't an alarm. A human sound. Brief. Cut off. He didn't let himself think about that yet. Declan, Voss again. And now there was something underneath the precision. Not fear exactly, the controlled compression of it, the sound of a person holding something very heavy, very carefully. The patrol frigate that fired on us is coming back around. Diplomatic channels are not producing results. The Drathvek commander's response to the Kethvin Convention invocation was, and I'm quoting here, anatomically improbable and involved my mother. A beat. We have approximately 20 minutes before someone decides we're worth the full ammunition expenditure. 20 minutes. Declan turned slowly in the engine room. His eyes moved across the space the way they always did when he was calculating. Not looking at things exactly. Cataloging them. The mining laser array. Cracked housing, but 2 of the 4 emitter heads still functional. Power coupling that ran directly to the ship's main bus. The warp core. 800 megawatts at full output. Currently running at 73% efficiency, but that number was climbing. The waste ejection system. High-pressure manifolds running along the starboard wall like the spine of something industrial and patient. Thermal processing chambers. Mass driver tubes designed to eject processed asteroid slag at sufficient velocity to clear the ship's operational radius. The fabrication bay. Dark now. Printers and lathes and plasma cutters waiting. Zero weapons. That was what the manifest said. That was what the Interstellar Engineering Cooperative Certification said. That was what every piece of paperwork associated with the MSV Prometheus said. The manifest had never met Declan Rourke. He started smiling. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man doing math that the universe hadn't approved yet. Kirsch saw it, took a step backward, which was impressive given that Kirsch had 6 limbs to coordinate. Why are you making that expression? What expression? The one that suggests you have an idea that will either save us or kill us faster. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Declan was already moving toward the waste ejection manifold, pulling up schematics on his wrist display. His fingers flew across the interface. "Captain," he said into the earpiece, "I need you to buy me an hour, and I need you to not ask what I'm going to do with the waste disposal system." Silence on the line. Then, "Do I want to know?" "Absolutely not." Another silence. Longer. 1 hour, Declan. He pulled the full schematic up on the main engineering display. The complete layout of the Prometheus spread out before him like a puzzle. Every system, every conduit, every manifold and coupling and override. And he could see already the shape of the solution. It was insane. It was probably illegal under at least 3 interstellar conventions. It was going to work. He grabbed the plasma torch from his belt and looked at Kirsch. "I'm going to need your help with something that violates the Geneva Convention, the laws of thermodynamics, and probably good taste." He ignited the torch. The blue flame hissed to life, painting his face in cold light. "Hand me that secondary coupling wrench. The big one." Kirsch stared at him for a long moment, all 4 eyes wide, the upper 2 tracking between Declan's face and the waste ejection manifold, the lower 2 fixed on the plasma torch. Then, with the expression of a creature making peace with its own mortality, Kirsch reached for the wrench. The waste ejection system in its intended configuration was deeply boring. High-pressure manifolds, thermal processing chambers, mass driver tubes designed to eject processed asteroid slag at sufficient velocity to clear the ship's operational radiuses without creating navigational hazards. Safe, reliable, certified to 17 different interstellar safety standards. Declan was about to make it none of those things. "The slag," he said, not looking up from the manifold housing he was currently disassembling, with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb while simultaneously building a different bomb, "is the key. We process thousands of tons of nickel-iron asteroid material every standard week. The thermal processing chambers superheat it to around 4,000 Kelvin before ejection. At that temperature, it's not solid anymore. It's a slurry, molten rock and metal, and the mass driver tubes can accelerate it to about 2 kilometers per second. Kirsch was holding 3 components in 3 of his 6 arms, a 4th arm braced against the manifold housing for stability, and the remaining 2 pressed flat against his sides, in what Declan had come to recognize as the Velnathi equivalent of covering your eyes. "You want to weaponize garbage. I want to weaponize everything." Declan pulled a wire-free strip, the insulation with his teeth, reconnected it to a different terminal. His hands moved with the efficiency of muscle memory. 11 years of deep space engineering, 2 degrees from MIT, and a childhood spent taking apart every piece of machinery his parents owned and occasionally remembering to put them back together. The Drathvek frigate shields are calibrated for energy weapons and kinetic torpedoes. Military-grade targeting, military-grade threat assessment. He looked up briefly. His eyes were bright. They have never in the history of their species had to think about what happens when someone fires a shotgun blast of 4,000 Kelvin molten rock at them, because no one has ever been insane enough to try them. A pause. Until now. He went back to the wiring. The temperature gauge on the manifold housing was already climbing. The thermal chambers were cycling up. Somewhere in the bowels of the ship, processors were grinding asteroid material into the consistency of lava. The volume is the key. It's not one projectile. It's thousands, tens of thousands, each one small enough to slip through the gaps in a shield matrix that's looking for coherent energy beams or solid mass torpedoes. He paused, considering the tactical implications the way some people considered chess moves. They'll punch through sensor arrays, clog intake vents, melt hull plating. It's like being hit by a volcano, except the volcano is moving at 2 kilometers per second and doesn't care about your feelings. Kirsch was silent for a moment. Then, this violates 14 safety protocols. 14? I counted 17. I was being conservative. From the bridge through the open comms channel, Declan could hear Captain Voss. She was broadcasting to both fleets simultaneously. Her standard was crisp and precise, with the particular quality of someone performing calm while standing in a burning building. Attention Drathvek and Oivari fleet commanders. Be advised that the MSV Prometheus is currently transporting unstable experimental materials under Cooperative Research Directive 7. Destruction of this vessel would result in contamination of the surrounding sector to a radius of approximately formed a fractional pause, the pause of someone inventing a number. 4 light minutes. We strongly recommend all vessels maintain safe distance while we navigate clear of the engagement zone. Declan listened to this and felt a surge of genuine admiration. It was a magnificent bluff. It was also, as bluffs went, the kind that worked exactly once and then got you killed when the other party called it. But once was all they needed. The Drathvek commander's response came through on the open channel. A sound like gravel in a cement mixer, which the translation matrix rendered as your contamination claim is noted and disregarded. You have 10 minutes to surrender your vessel or be destroyed. 10 minutes. Declan looked at the manifold, at the bypassed interlocks, at the rewired thermal couplings, at the jury-rigged interface that would let him fire 800 tons of superheated slag like a weapon instead of waste. Kirsch, he said, I need you to bypass the safety interlocks on the ejection manifold. How many interlocks? All of them. Kirsch's 4 eyes tracked to the safety manual mounted on the wall, a thick laminated document that Kirsch had clearly read multiple times and possibly slept with. All of them. Every single one. The silence stretched. Declan watched Kirsch's face, the way the modulated skin shifted, the grinding teeth working, the upper 2 eyes closing briefly in what might have been a prayer to whatever Velnathi engineers prayed to. Then Kirsch moved to the interlock panel and began with methodical precision, bypassing 14 safety systems designed to prevent exactly what Declan was about to do. "Why me?" Declan asked, genuinely curious. Kirsch didn't look up. "Because the alternative is dying with all safety protocols intact. That seems wasteful." Declan grinned. "Mema, there's hope for you yet." They worked in a rhythm that surprised Declan. Kirsch anticipated needs, passed components before Declan asked, held tolerances steady with 4 arms, while Declan welded with both hands. The Velnathi were meticulous engineers trained in protocols and procedures and the careful observation of safety margins. Declan was a chaos engine held together by coffee and spite, and a refusal to acknowledge that the universe had opinions about what was possible. Together, they were something else entirely. The modification took 43 minutes, not the hour Declan had asked for. 43 minutes because he'd been conservative in his estimate, and because Kirsch turned out to be faster than expected once the safety protocols stopped being a psychological obstacle and started being kindling. The result was ugly, a tangle of rewired conduits, bypassed interlocks, jury-rigged thermal couplings that would have given any certified engineer a stress-induced cardiac event. The manifold housing was running 15 degrees hotter than rated. The pressure gauge was pegged at the upper limit, and the interface Declan had cobbled together from spare parts and sheer stubbornness looked like something built by a particularly deranged artist. It was also Declan was fairly certain going to work. "Captain," he said into the earpiece, "I need the frigate on our port side." "It's already there." Voss's voice was tight, controlled. "It's charging weapons again." "Perfect." He pulled up the ejection system controls on the engineering panel. The interface was wrong, still showing standard slag disposal parameters because he hadn't had time to write new software. He was going to have to do this manually. Old school, the way engineers did things before automation made them soft. "Kirsch," he said, "when I say fire, I need you to open the thermal chamber release valve and the manifold pressure valve simultaneously. full pressure. Don't wait for the temperature gauge to stabilize. The temperature gauge not stabilizing means it'll be hotter. That's fine, that's better. Declan watched the targeting display. The frigate was 200 kilometers off the port bow, turning ponderously to bring its main weapons to bear. Big ship, heavily armored, designed to fight other warships in the kind of prolonged engagements where victory went to whoever had the thickest hull plating and the most stubborn captain. It had never been designed to fight a garbage truck. Fire! Kirsch opened the valves. The Prometheus shuddered. Not from impact this time. From recoil. The sudden violent expulsion of approximately 800 tons of superheated slag through the modified ejection tubes at velocities that made the ship's structural framework scream in protest. The sound was extraordinary. A deep percussive whoomp that Declan felt in his sternum, followed by a sustained roar like a waterfall made of fire. The deck plates vibrated. The manifold housing glowed cherry red at the coupling points. And somewhere in the thermal processing chambers, sensors were screaming warnings that no one was listening to because Declan had bypassed them 43 minutes ago. On the external camera feed, it looked like the ship had sneezed the sun. The slag cloud expanded outward in a cone of incandescent fury. Thousands of fragments, each one the size of a fist, each one carrying enough thermal energy to melt through steel. The vacuum of space did nothing to cool them. At 4,000 Kelvin, radiant heat was their weapon, and physics was their ammunition. The Drathvek frigate's shields flared, brilliant blue-white, the color of Cherenkov radiation, the color of a system working exactly as designed, electromagnetic fields deflecting and dissipating incoming threats with the casual efficiency of military-grade engineering. For about half a second, then the volume overwhelmed the matrix. Shield generators were built to handle coherent threats, energy beams, kinetic torpedoes, missiles with targeting computers and predictable trajectories. They were not built to handle tens of thousands of small, molten, completely random projectiles arriving simultaneously from a single vector. The shields didn't fail. They saturated, and everything that got through after saturation hit bare metal. The frigate's sensor arrays went first, delicate instruments, precision-engineered detection systems designed to track targets across millions of kilometers. Never designed for this. Never designed to be shredded by impacts that the targeting computers couldn't track because there were too many of them coming too fast from too close. The arrays exploded in cascades of sparks and venting atmosphere. Then the intake vents clogged. The frigate's engines ran on a delicate balance of fuel flow and oxidizer mix with intake vents that pulled in trace hydrogen from space to supplement the reaction mass. Those vents were now clogged with cooling slag that hardened in the vacuum and blocked airflow like arterial plaque. The engines coughed, stuttered, coughed again. The hull plating on the port side buckled, then melted in patches where concentrated fragments hit the same location twice, then tore because metal subjected to rapid heating and cooling develops stress fractures, and stress fractures develop opinions about structural integrity. The frigate didn't explode, it choked. Its massive frame listed to starboard, trailing debris like a wounded animal. Drive plasma vented from a dozen small wounds. The running lights flickered, died, flickered again, and then it began to drift. Not under power, not under control, just drift. Declan watched this on the monitor, breathing hard, hands still on the controls. His heart was doing something irregular. A rhythm that felt like it was trying to escape his chest through force of will alone. He didn't care. "That's what you get," he said quietly, "for shooting at a garbage truck." The silence on the bridge channel lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Voss, her voice carrying a note Declan had never heard before. Something that might have been awe or horror, or the particular combination of both that came from watching someone do something that should have been impossible. "Declan, you have their attention now." The Drathvek fleet noticed. That was the problem with hurting one of their ships. It was like poking a very large, very armored animal with a very small stick. The animal didn't run. It turned around. 3 destroyers broke from the main engagement and oriented on the Prometheus. Each one 4 times the mass of the frigate Declan had just crippled. Their transponder signatures burned bright and angry on the tactical overlay. At the same time, the Oivari swarm cluster began redirecting. Not retreating, redirecting toward them. They think we're a threat, Kirsch said, studying the display with all four eyes. We are a threat. We are a mining vessel. Declan looked at him. What do you think the difference is? Kirsch opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the tactical display, looked at Declan. Currently, Kirsch said slowly, very little. The mining laser array was a mess. The housing had taken a direct hit in that first warning shot. The mounting brackets were warped. Two of the four emitter heads were cracked beyond repair. And the primary focusing assembly had sheared clean off, probably floating somewhere in space as a very expensive piece of debris. What remained was one functional emitter head, a secondary focusing assembly rated for asteroid-cutting operations, and a power coupling that connected directly to the ship's main bus. The main bus which also connected to the warp core. Declan stared at this for a long moment, doing math that made his eyes go slightly unfocused. The mining laser at standard operation drew about 40 megawatts from the ship's power systems, enough to cut through nickel-iron asteroids with the patient efficiency of industrial equipment. The warp core at full output could supply approximately 800 megawatts. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between a tool that cut rocks and something considerably more interesting. The problem was the focusing assembly. It was rated for 40 megawatts. At 800, it would melt. Eventually, the question was how long eventually took and whether he could build something to extend it. Fabrication bay, he said. I need lens components. Synthetic sapphire substrate if we have it. Thermal-resistant bonding compound. And I need you to hold the secondary assembly steady while I modify the power coupling. Kirsch was already moving toward the fabrication bay. How long do we have before the destroyers are in weapons range? 12 minutes. And the Oivari swarm? Maybe 20. And how long will this take? 11 minutes. Kirsch's four eyes blinked in sequence. That is not a comfortable margin. No, Declan agreed and started welding. They worked in the red emergency lighting, the fabrication bay printer running in the background, extruding lens components to Declan's hastily typed specifications. He was welding with one hand and adjusting parameters with the other, talking through the design as he built it. Not for Kirsch's benefit exactly, but because thinking out loud helped him catch errors. And errors here would mean either a weapon that didn't work or a weapon that worked too well in the wrong direction. The power coupling exploded at minute 7, not catastrophically, not the kind of explosion that ended conversations permanently, but enough, a pressure release, a spray of superheated coolant, and a fragment of coupling housing that caught Declan across the left forearm with enough force to open a 4-centimeter gash. He hissed, pulled back, looked at the wound with the detached assessment of a man who had been hurt before and had opinions about it. Blood, more than ideal, less than critical. The arm was still functional. You are injured, Kirsch said. I've noticed. Declan reached into his jumpsuit pocket, found a roll of electrical tape because electrical tape was the universal solution to problems both electrical and biological. He wrapped the arm with 3 tight loops, pulling the wound closed through compression, and the sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge that human tissue had different requirements than insulated wire. The bleeding slowed, not stopped, but slowed. That is not a medical assessment. It's an engineering assessment. Good enough means functional. He flexed the arm. Pain shot up to his elbow. He ignored it with the practice of someone who'd spent 11 years in deep space where the nearest doctor was usually 11 days away, and complaining about injuries was considered poor form. I'm functional. He went back to the coupling. Kirsch held the assembly. His 4 eyes kept tracking to Declan's arm, to the tape, to the slow dark stains spreading underneath it. He didn't say anything else. That Declan thought was growth. The Drathvek destroyers opened fire at minute 10. The Prometheus had mining-grade shields, electromagnetic deflectors designed to protect the hull from debris, impacts, and radiation during asteroid operations. They were not military shields. They were not designed to absorb directed energy weapons fire from 3 destroyers simultaneously. They absorbed the first salvo anyway because physics didn't care about design intent, and electromagnetic fields were electromagnetic fields. The second salvo hit the hull directly. Deck 7 went dark. The port cargo section, already compromised from the earlier hit, lost structural integrity entirely. Declan heard the groan of metal giving way, felt it through the deck plates. A deep subsonic vibration that meant something large and important had just stopped existing in its original form. The damage reports updated. 2 more crew members. He didn't look at the names, couldn't afford to look at the names yet. "Captain," he said, "I need 30 seconds of clear line of sight on the lead destroyer." "Working on it." Her voice was tight, controlled. The compression of fear so complete it had become something else. Something cold and precise and very, very focused. Through his earpiece he could hear the bridge. Crew calling out vectors. Voss issuing corrections in clipped syllables, her voice carrying the precision of someone who'd spent 8 years commanding destroyers before she'd decided civilian life was less stressful. She'd been wrong about that. The Prometheus moved in ways it was never designed to move its massive industrial frame, responding to her inputs with the reluctant grace of a very large animal being asked to dance. But Voss flew it like a warship anyway because some instincts you never lost. She gave him his 30 seconds. Declan fired the modified mining laser. The beam that came out of the emitter head was not the focused, controlled cutting tool that had spent years slicing through nickel-iron asteroids with the patient efficiency of industrial machinery. It was something raw, angrier, fed by 800 megawatts of warp core output through a focusing assembly that was already beginning to glow at the edges, the synthetic sapphire substrate radiating heat in the infrared spectrum like a star about to go supernova. It was coherent light turned into a structural argument. The beam hit the lead Drathvek destroyer amidships. The destroyer's hull armor was rated for military-grade energy weapons, designed to withstand sustained bombardment from other capital ships. Layers of ablative plating and reactive compounds that dispersed energy across broad surface areas, turning killing blows into glancing strikes. It was not rated for this. The beam cut through the armor plating like it wasn't there, because at that power level, at that energy density, it essentially wasn't. Through the armor, through the interior compartments, through the far hull, out the other side, a perfectly straight line of superheated destruction that bisected the destroyer like a surgical incision performed by someone who didn't care about the patient's survival. The destroyer split, not cleanly. Nothing about it was clean. The two halves separated slowly at first, then faster as internal atmosphere vented in crystallizing clouds. As secondary explosions rippled through the engineering sections, as the reactor containment designed to handle the slow, controlled fusion that powered a warship suddenly found itself exposed to vacuum and hard radiation and the catastrophic failure of every safety system simultaneously. The reactor breach lit up the surrounding space in a brief, terrible bloom of blue-white light. The kind of light that represented enough energy to power a small city for a year, released in approximately 2 seconds. Krush watched this on the monitor, all 4 eyes wide, grinding teeth slightly parted. That was a mining tool. "Everything's a mining tool," Declan said, already watching the lens assembly temperature gauge climb toward critical. "If the thing you're mining is enemy morale." The Oivari hit them from the starboard side 30 seconds later. The swarm was different. Not 3 massive destroyers broadcasting their presence like angry gods, but hundreds of small ships, each one fast and maneuverable, coordinating with the eerie precision of a hive mind. Because that was exactly what it was. They didn't attack in lines, didn't attack in formations. They attacked in patterns. Overlapping fields of fire that covered every angle, simultaneously probing for weaknesses with the methodical patience of something that didn't experience individual loss as loss. The slag cannon was wrong for this. Too slow to track individual targets. Too diffuse to concentrate fire on ships that moved like gnats and coordinated like neurons. The mining laser was wrong for this too. The lens assembly was already at 80% of its thermal limit, and the swarm ships were too small, too fast for a beam weapon to track effectively. The Prometheus took hit after hit, each one small, each one precise, each one aimed at a system rather than the hull. The Ovari were trying to disable, not destroy, which meant they wanted the ship intact, which meant they wanted something. And that thought was somehow more frightening than simple destruction. Smoke in the corridors now, the ventilation system struggling. The lights on Deck 3 had gone entirely. The emergency lighting on Deck 5 was flickering in a pattern that suggested the power coupling there was about to fail in the same spectacular fashion as the one that had decorated Declan's arm with electrical tape. He moved through the engine room in the red, half-dark rerouting, power-patching conduits, keeping the reactor stable through sheer force of will and a detailed knowledge of which systems could be sacrificed and which ones couldn't. His arm had stopped hurting. That was either good news or very bad news, and he didn't have time to determine which. Declan, Voss's voice. And there it was, the thing he'd never heard before. In 3 years of working with her, in 11 years of deep space engineering, in a career that had included 2 reactor near misses, 1 catastrophic hull breach, and the time a mining laser had accidentally ignited a methane pocket in an asteroid and turned it into a temporary small moon. He'd never heard this in her voice. Hull integrity is at 31%. We've lost shields entirely. I have 3 Wavari swarm ships locked on our reactor housing, and I am out of maneuvers. Declan was already looking at the warp drive. The warp core housing dominated the aft section of the engine room, a cylinder 3 meters in diameter and 12 meters long, wrapped in magnetic containment coils and thermal shielding, humming at a frequency that Declan felt in his bones. It was the one system he hadn't touched. He'd thought about this before. Every engineer had. Late-night discussions in the academy about theoretical applications nobody was supposed to talk about. The cooperative called it academic curiosity. Declan called it the day someone really pisses us off. Humans didn't prepare for war the way other species did. They didn't stockpile weapons or train standing armies for deep space. They just made sure that when the time came, every tool could become something else. Every system had a backup mode that the manual didn't mention. The calculations had been waiting in the back of his head for 11 years. He just never thought he'd need them. Until now. No, Kirsch said. Yes. That is not. Kirsch stopped. Start it again. You cannot weaponize a warp drive. Declan was already moving toward the housing pulling panels, exposing the containment coil architecture underneath. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the particular electric excitement of a man who had just seen the solution to a problem that everyone else thought was unsolvable. The warp field doesn't move the ship, he said, pulling a panel free and setting it aside. Not really. What it does is create a region of compressed space-time ahead of the ship and expanded space-time behind it. The ship falls into the compression. That's all warp travel is. Controlled space-time distortion. He looked at the coil architecture, at the field geometry controls, at the containment parameters. What happens if the field isn't controlled? What happens if you create the distortion without the directionality, without the containment? Kirsch was very still. The tidal forces, Kirsch said slowly, at the boundary of an uncontained warp field gradient would be catastrophic for anything caught in them. Yes, Declan started pulling the containment geometry controls. I'm not building a weapon. I'm building a phenomenon. Kirsch looked at him for a long moment, then quietly. This will destroy the warp drive. Yes. We will be stranded. We'll be alive, Declan turned, which is better than the alternative. Another long moment. Then Kirsch moved to the opposite side of the housing and began with 6 arms and the focused precision of a very good engineer who had recently stopped caring about safety protocols helping him pull panels. Declan called the bridge. Captain, I need exactly 4 minutes, and then I need you to point us directly at the center of both fleets. Silence, then both fleets. A pause that contained Declan suspected a very large number of thoughts that Voss was choosing not to say out loud. 4 minutes, Declan. He looked at the exposed warp core, at the containment coils, at the field geometry controls that he was about to rewire into something that had never existed before and probably shouldn't exist now. He was covered in blood. Some his, some from crew members he'd helped move through the corridors when the port cargo section collapsed. Grease, burn marks, the particular grime of a man who had been fighting a war with a toolbox. His arm throbbed under the electrical tape. His eyes were bright. He had the worst idea of his life, and 4 minutes to make it real. 4 minutes was not enough time. 4 minutes was also exactly enough time because Declan had stopped distinguishing between those two things approximately 43 minutes ago. The warp core's containment architecture was up close a thing of genuine beauty. Magnetic coil arrays wound in precise geometric patterns, each one calibrated to shape the space-time distortion into a coherent directional field. The engineers who had designed it had been brilliant. They had also been, in Declan's current assessment, catastrophically unimaginative. They had built a system to do one thing and had never once asked what it could do if you removed the constraints. He was asking now. The field geometry, controls, he said, hands moving through the coil architecture, are what give the warp field its direction. Remove the directionality, flatten the geometry to a sphere, and the field expands outward equally in all directions. He was rewiring as he talked. Kirsch working the opposite side of the housing in perfect synchronization. 6 arms threading cables through conduit runs with a speed and precision that Declan had stopped being surprised by. The containment coils are what keep the field stable. Reduce the containment, not eliminate it, reduce it, and the field becomes unstable. It pulses, it breathes. He paused a wire between his teeth, both hands occupied. An unstable spherical warp field pulsing outward from the Prometheus as the center point will create a space-time gradient at its boundary. Anything caught in that gradient will experience differential tidal forces. The leading edge of the object, Kirsch said, not looking up from his work, will be in compressed space-time. The trailing edge will be in expanded space-time. The object itself will be subjected to forces acting in opposite directions simultaneously. A pause. At sufficient field strength, this would exceed the tensile limits of any known material. At sufficient field strength, Declan agreed yes. And the field strength you are planning to generate, sufficient. Kirsch's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. I see. The Prometheus shook continuously now. Not the discrete impacts of earlier, but a sustained rolling punishment as the Oivari swarm maintained their assault and the 2 remaining Drathvek destroyers closed range. Through his earpiece, Declan could hear the bridge in real time. Crew voices tight with controlled panic. Damage reports stacking up faster than they could be processed. Voss's voice cutting through it all like a blade. Starboard thrusters full burn, giving me the vector I asked for. And underneath her voice, the sound of the ship itself. The groan and shriek of metal under stress. The percussion of impacts. The hisses of atmosphere venting from places it shouldn't be venting from. He had 2 minutes left when the power coupling on the containment coil array failed. Not the same coupling as before, a different one. The Prometheus was running out of components that hadn't been stressed past their limits, and the laws of physics, unlike Declan, did not negotiate. The failure sent a surge through the coil array that lit up 3 of the field geometry controls and left them dark. He stared at the dark controls for approximately 1 second, the second it took to run the calculation, to determine what the loss of those 3 controls meant for the field geometry, to decide whether it was fatal. It wasn't fatal, it was worse than his original design. The field would be asymmetric, stronger on the port side than the starboard, which meant the effective radius would be uneven, which meant the tidal forces at the boundary would vary. Some ships would get more than others. He decided this was acceptable. Kirsch, he said, I need you to manually hold the secondary containment coil in the open position when I activate the field. It's going to want to close. That's the fail-safe. Don't let it close. Kirsch looked at the coil in question. It was approximately the size of a large dog, wrapped in superconducting wire currently sitting in a housing that was radiating heat at a level that made the air above it shimmer. Manually, you have 6 arms. 2 of them are rated for high-temperature environments, rated for moderate high-temperature environments. Close enough. Declan met Kirsch's 4 eyes. I know what I'm asking. A long moment, the ship shook. Something exploded on deck 2. He felt it through the deck plates, a sharp, definitive crack that meant structural failure, not just damage. Somewhere above him, someone was shouting. Hand me the thermal insulation wrap, Kirsch said. Declan handed it over. Kirsch wrapped 2 of his arms methodically, efficiently, with the focused calm of a creature that had made a decision and was done second-guessing it. Then Kirsch positioned himself at the secondary containment coil and braced all 6 limbs against the housing. Ready. Declan called the bridge. Captain, now. He heard her. Not her voice, but the Prometheus itself responding to her hands. The thrusters firing in a sequence that turned the massive ship on its axis, pointing it toward the gap between the 2 fleets. Both fleets were firing on them. The ship was coming apart in real time, systems failing in cascades. The damage reports a continuous stream of bad news that Declan had stopped reading because reading them would mean acknowledging them, and acknowledging them would mean stopping, and stopping was not an option. Voss flew them through hell, 4 minutes of hell, precise and controlled and magnificent. The Prometheus moving through a crossfire that should have destroyed it 3 times over. Voss threading gaps between weapons fire with a ship that had the maneuverability of a very large, very stubborn brick. He heard her on the bridge channel, her voice never breaking, never rising, calling out adjustments in the same tone she used for routine navigation. 15 degrees port. Compensate for the drift. Give me full burn on the starboard array. Declan activated the modified warp field. The sound it made was not an explosion. It was not a weapon sound. It was something older. A deep subsonic pulse that Declan felt in his teeth, in his chest, and somewhere behind his eyes. A sound that the human body recognized as wrong in the way that it recognized the sound of a large predator in the dark. The warp core's hum changed pitch, climbing, climbing, and then the field expanded outward. On the external cameras, the ones that were still functional space around the Prometheus did something that space was not supposed to do. It rippled, like heat haze, but wrong. The stars behind the ripple were in the wrong places, shifted by the distortion. Their light bent around the field boundary in ways that made Declan's eyes hurt when he tried to track them. The ripple expanded outward in a sphere, uneven on the port side where the failed controls had skewed the geometry, but expanding, growing, reaching. The Oivari swarm ships hit the field boundary first. They were closest. The effect was not instantaneous. It was worse than instantaneous. It was visible. The small, fast ships caught in the gradient began to deform, their hulls twisting as the space-time differential applied forces that no structural material was designed to resist. They didn't explode. They unraveled, slowly, terribly, the way a cloth tears when pulled from both ends simultaneously, the way metal fails under torsion stress, the way things come apart when the universe stops agreeing that they should be together. The debris that remained was wrong-shaped, twisted into geometries that hurt to look at. The Drothvek destroyers were larger. They lasted longer, long enough for Declan to watch on the monitor as the field reached them, long enough to see the hull plating begin to buckle. The weapons arrays twist out of alignment, the drive sections separate from the main hull with a slow grinding inevitability, long enough to see the secondary explosions as internal systems failed under the tidal stress. Brief blooms of light in the distorted space around the Prometheus. Kirsch held the containment coil, both thermal-wrapped arms locked around it, all 6 limbs braced, holding it open against the failsafe that kept trying to close it, that kept trying to make it stop. Declan watched the field strength gauge and the coil temperature simultaneously, running the numbers, waiting for the moment when the field had done what it needed to do. The warp core temperature hit critical. The field began to collapse. "Let go," Declan said. Kirsch let go. The containment coil slammed shut. The field imploded back toward the ship. Not catastrophically, not the way it would have if he'd lost control entirely, but hard enough to throw both of them off their feet. Hard enough to crack the remaining display screens. Hard enough to make the Prometheus ring like a bell struck by something enormous. Then silence. Not complete silence. The ship was still making sounds. The sounds of damage and stress and systems failing in slow cascades. But the weapons fire had stopped. The impacts had stopped. The continuous percussion of the battle had stopped. And in its absence, the silence was so profound that Declan could hear his own heartbeat. He was on the floor. He didn't remember getting there. His back was against the warp core housing, which was hot enough to be uncomfortable. His hands were in his lap. They were shaking. Not from excitement this time, from the particular full-body tremor of a nervous system that had been running on adrenaline for too long and had just run out. He looked at the warp core. The temperature gauge was in the red. The field geometry controls were dark. The containment coil array was locked in its closed position and would not be opening again. The warp drive was as he had predicted slag. He looked at the external camera feed. The surviving ships, those that had been outside the field's effective radius, the ones at the edges of both fleets, were moving away. Both fleets, retreating, from a mining vessel, from a ship with no weapons, from 40,000 tons of industrial equipment, and one engineer with a plasma torch and nothing to lose. Kirsch was sitting on the deck 3 meters away. all 6 arms limp at his sides, the thermal insulation wrap on 2 of them scorched and partially melted, all 4 eyes open, staring at the camera feed. His expression was the expression of a creature that had witnessed something it did not have a category for. "That was a warp drive," Kirsch said very quietly. Declan laughed. It came out wrong, shaky and high and slightly hysterical. The laughter of a man who had just arm-wrestled the laws of physics and was still processing the fact that he'd won. It wasn't triumphant laughter. It was the laughter of someone who had been genuinely, completely certain they were going to die and had been wrong. And the wrongness of it was so profound that the only available response was to laugh at it. "Yeah," he said when he could speak again. "Yeah, it was." The comms crackled. Voss's voice, raw, stripped of its usual precision. The voice of a person who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been allowed to put it down. "All stations, this is the captain. We're alive." A pause. "Damage report when you can." Another pause. Longer. "And Declan, never do that again." He leaned his head back against the warp core housing. The heat was almost comfortable. His arm throbbed. His hands were still shaking. The engine room smelled like burnt metal and ozone and the particular acrid scent of a warp core that had been pushed past every limit its designers had imagined. "No promises, Captain." The translation system chimed, an intercepted transmission flagged by the comms array as high priority. He almost ignored it. Then he looked at the source codes, Drathvek command frequency and Oivari hive channel, both broadcasting simultaneously, both flagged as fleet-wide alerts. He pulled up the translation. The Drathvek message was terse, military, the kind of communication that had been stripped of everything except operational necessity. Alert, human vessel class unknown. Engagement resulted in total loss of forward elements. Vessel confirmed unarmed. Repeat unarmed. Do not engage. Transmit to all fleet commands. The Oivari message was longer, more complex. The hive mind's characteristic layered syntax rendering it strange in translation. Warning propagated. Human engineering vessel. No weapons detected. No weapons required. Vessel demonstrated capacity for space-time manipulation. Classification extreme threat. Recommendation avoid all contact. Human vessels without weapons are more dangerous than human vessels with weapons. Reason unknown. Hypothesis, they improvise. Declan read this twice. Then he closed his eyes and smiled. A real smile this time. Not the manic grin of a man building something insane, but the quiet, exhausted smile of a man who had just heard the universe say something true. They improvise. Beside him, Kirsch had pulled out a data pad. His 4 eyes were focused on it with the particular intensity of an engineer who had had an idea. 2 of his arms were sketching modifications to the slag cannon. Declan could see adjustments to the thermal chamber geometry that would increase the ejection velocity by approximately 15%. The other 4 arms were still limp. The thermal wrapping was still scorched. Kirsch was doing this on autopilot, the way engineers did things when the idea was too good to wait for the rest of the body to recover. The corruption Declan thought was complete. He looked at the engine room, at the ruined warp drive, the modified slag cannon, the jury-rigged mining laser, the bypass safety systems, the scorch marks and the sparks in the electrical tape on his arm, and the wrench still embedded in the far bulkhead from the very first shockwave before any of this had started. At the evidence of everything they'd built and broken and rebuilt in the last 43 minutes. He thought about Rashid Okafor, about the voice cutting off on the crew channel, about the names on the damage report he hadn't let himself read yet. He'd read them. He'd read all of them. Just not yet. For now he sat on the floor of the engine room of the MSV Prometheus, a ship with no weapons and no warp drive and 31% hull integrity, drifting in the wreckage of 2 alien fleets, and he listened to the silence where the battle had been. 3 weeks later, the intercepted transmissions had become something else entirely. Declan sat in the repaired medical bay visiting Rashid. His friend was in recovery, multiple fractures, collapsed lung, but alive. Alive mattered more than anything else. "Did we really just fight 2 alien war fleets with mining tools?" Rashid asked. His voice was weak, but his eyes were bright. The same eyes Declan had seen wide with fear when the hull breach alarm went off. When Rashid had known in that moment that he might not make it. But he had made it. They both had. "We didn't fight them," Declan said. "No, we improvised them to death." Rashid laughed. The sound caught in his chest, turned into a wince, then became laughter again. Painful laughter, the kind that said he was alive enough to hurt and grateful for it. "Martinez didn't make it," Rashid said quietly. "Chen, Okoye, I heard the names." Declan nodded. He would read them. Soon. "They knew the risks," Rashid said. "We all did. Mining's dangerous even without the wars." "Yeah, but we won December. We actually won." "We survived," Declan corrected. "That's not the same thing." "Close enough." Rashid was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why'd you wait so long to read the names 3 weeks?" Declan looked at the floor. "Because if I'd read them during the fight, I would have stopped being an engineer. Would have started being someone who just lost friends. And friends don't keep ships running. Math does." Rashid nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that." The comms officer had been collecting the transmissions, broadcasting them over the ship's internal network. A reminder, a monument, a story that was already spreading across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Galactic Defense Network Advisory. Human civilian vessels classified as unpredictable, high-threat entities regardless of armament status. Mining vessels, cargo haulers, and survey ships are considered armed equivalent. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Human engineers view safety protocols as suggestions impossible. It as challenge in civilian equipment as weapons awaiting assembly instructions. Drathvek High Command, internal memo. Fleet operations revised. Human space designated no contact zone. The Prometheus incident demonstrates human engineering capacity for rapid improvisation under combat conditions. Conventional threat assessment models are invalid. Species weaponizes civilian infrastructure in minutes. Avari hive mind distributed analysis most concerning finding humans demonstrated restraint after achieving total tactical superiority. Chose not to eliminate all surviving vessels despite having capacity to do so. Implies strategic thinking beyond immediate conflict resolution. Cultural value placed on mercy or calculated intimidation. Possibly both. Revised threat assessment, catastrophic if provoked. Unpredictable if peaceful. Recommend maximum caution in all future encounters. Declan read these in the quiet of the engine room. The new warp drive was being installed. 8 weeks of work ahead. But they'd been picked up by a human transport convoy 2 days after the battle, towed to the nearest repair station, given emergency supplies and a Security Council commendation that Declan had immediately filed in a drawer and forgotten about. What mattered was the work. What mattered was that they'd survived. Kirsch had submitted a formal request to the Interstellar Engineering Cooperative, permanent transfer to human engineering operations. Application approved within 6 hours. Reasons cited in the official documentation: cultural compatibility, philosophical alignment with human approach to problem solving. Prefer working with species that views obstacles as opportunities rather than limitations. Reasons cited in Kirsch's personal log, which Declan had been allowed to read. Declan stood alone in the corridor outside Medical Base 7. The datapad in his hand displayed 7 names. He'd avoided looking at them for 3 weeks. Now with the Prometheus docked at Titan Station and the immediate crisis over, he owed them this. Rashid had asked him earlier why he'd waited. Because Declan had said, if I read them during the fight, I'd stop thinking like an engineer. I'd start thinking like someone who just lost friends. And friends don't keep you alive when the ship's coming apart. Math does. He read the names now, slowly. Each one a person he'd shared meals with, argued with about thruster efficiency, nodded to in the corridors during shift changes. 7 names, 43 minutes. The first number was fixed. The second was the cost. He would carry both for the rest of his life. Professor Sarah Castellanos had commissioned it personally. When they tell you it can't be done, they're really just saying they don't know how you're going to do it yet. Declan Rourke, MSV Prometheus. Incident 2114. Declan had received a photo of it via tight beam transmission. He'd stared at it for a long time, then filed it next to the commendation. He sat in the engine room surrounded by the machinery that had saved their lives. The slag cannon, the mining laser. The space where the warp core had been now just an empty housing waiting for its replacement. He thought about what they'd done. what it meant. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't a weapon. It never had been. It was the look in an engineer's eye when you told him something was impossible. That particular dangerous light that meant he'd already started building the proof you were wrong. The Prometheus Protocol. That was what they were calling it now, not the slag cannon, not the mining laser, not the warp field weapon. The protocol was simpler than that. When someone threatens your home, you use everything you have. Your tools, your training, your creativity. And when you win, if you win, you show them mercy. Not because you're weak, but because you want them to remember what you chose not to do. 43 minutes to rewrite galactic warfare doctrine. 43 minutes to prove that unarmed doesn't mean harmless. 43 minutes for two engineers, one plasma torch, and absolutely nothing to lose to teach two empires the most important lesson in military history. Never corner the species that turned rocks into spaceships. Because when you do, you'll learn exactly what else they can turn into weapons. And if you survive that lesson, you'll spend the rest of your existence wondering what they'll improvise next. Declan closed his eyes. His hands had finally stopped shaking. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see it. The warp field expanding, space rippling, ships coming apart at the seams. The moment when physics bent to human stubbornness and three safety protocols became 17, and 17 became 0, and 0 became victory. They came looking for easy prey. They found engineers. In hindsight, they should have brought more ships.